Hello everyone, welcome back. This week we're going to be getting into animation proper. I know way back at the beginning of the semester we did a solar system and that obviously included some animation, but this time we're going to go a little slower and work on some of the fundamentals, primarily with a bouncing ball or three. So the first thing that I want to do is just kind of tour the interface. Particularly as it pertains to animation. Up until now, we've really only been focused on mostly modeling, a little bit of texturing and lights, but now we're going to actually start moving things around, so let's kind of refresh on where all that stuff is. First, we have our viewport. That is still going to be, important because that's where we manipulate objects, where we move them around, and make the changes that we're animating. Below that, we have the timeline, which up until now we've largely ignored. But now we can take a closer look at it. So we can expand it out if we need to. Not much changes, it just gets taller. As you get more keyframes, you'll start to see them kind of pile up, but we can keep it a little bit smaller down on the timeline. So we have a couple of menus with some settings, which we're not really going to worry about. We have a view menu and a marker menu. Again, we're not really going to worry about any of those. The defaults are fine for us, especially for today. We have our main controls here in the center. This first button is auto keying, so it's the little record symbol. Auto keying will automatically add a keyframe when you change value. So if I turn it on, grab this cube, move it, you can see that some keyframes popped up. I'm going to leave that off for now. I'm going to undo and leave that off. We'll come back to that, but I don't want that on just yet. Next, we have our playback controls. So in the center here, we have play animation, and we have play animation in reverse. And then we have moving out from the center, we have jump to keyframe. So if you have a bunch of keyframes in line, it'll jump between them, and then at the ends, it'll jump to the beginning and the end point. As you hover over each of them, you'll also notice that some shortcuts will come up. Shift left and right arrow will jump back and forth. Let me add a couple of keyframes here, and then we can kind of see those. So to add a keyframe, I'm going to do this a pretty quick way. I'm going to hit first N to bring up my view properties, and I can see, you can also see it here on the side with the object property selected, but I can see my current location, rotation, and scale for the object that I have selected. So I'm going to just hover over the X location, hit I. Okay, it's going to set a keyframe for all of those. You'll notice that turns yellow, and that's at frame 1. And now it becomes important to make sure that you're on the frame that you want to be on. I'm going to move forward 20 frames, and you can see that the location turns green, telling me that there is a keyframe for that object, but not on that current frame. And then I'll just move it in the X direction. Now it turns orange, and that's telling me that I've changed the value since the keyframe was made. I'm going to hover over that and hit I again. Now it turns yellow, telling me there's a keyframe on that frame. I'll go another 20 frames or so, and I'll move it up. And then I'll hover over and hit I again. Okay, so I have 3 keyframes. A terribly boring animation, but you can see how that goes. Now we can look at these playback controls. So I can play forward and pause. I can play backward and pause. Then I can jump between keyframes, and then I can jump to the ends. The shortcuts for that, so left and right, we'll step 1 frame at a time. Up and down, we'll jump between keyframes, and then shift left and shift right will go to the beginning and the end. So as you start using them, you'll get more comfortable and more familiar with those commands. Moving over to the right of the timeline, we have our current frame indicator. So frame 1. You'll also see the current frame indicated in the top left here. This 1 stands for frame 1. You'll notice that even the object's name in the viewport is yellow, telling you that there's a keyframe for that object on that frame. Okay. If I select the light and go to frame 1, you'll notice that it does not turn yellow. But as soon as I select the cube or deselect, it'll just show the most recent and that there is a keyframe there. So that's current frame indicator. Here we have preview range, which I don't really ever use. And then here are start and end frame. So if we want the animation to start on frame 1 and end on frame 40, I'll just set that end to 40, hit return or enter, and now when I play back, it'll just stop at frame 40, and then it'll automatically loop back. You can right-click on the timeline. It's going to actually bring up the dope sheet, which we'll talk about later what that is. But it's going to bring up a context menu that allows you to make some adjustments here just in the timeline, which can be faster for little adjustments. If you want to do more in-depth animation controls, then we'll be getting into the graph editor and the dope sheet here in a little bit. So those are the timeline controls. That's probably the majority of what we actually need to worry about right now. We can go here to our output properties, and you'll notice we have a frame and a start and end. That's going to automatically be updated as you adjust the range on the timeline. So we don't really need to worry about that. Once we start exporting, which we'll talk about how to export and render animations next week, this is when all of this stuff will become much more important. So the last thing you really need to know is, just as far as like the practical tools, is just how to add a keyframe. So I already showed one way, which is you can hover over a value and hit I. And this works for location, rotation, scale, but this also works for most other values and properties. So if I select this cube and I'm going to go into material preview so we can get a better sense of what's going on here. If I go to frame 1, so shift left arrow to go to the first frame, and hover over this metallic value and hit I, it'll set a keyframe. And then I can go to, I'll hit the up arrow a couple times, I'll jump to frame 40, and then I can change this metallic to 1 and hit I again. And now, as I play it back, let me set the end frame to like 50 so I don't have to wait that long. You can see that as the cube moves, it becomes more metallic. That's one of the coolest things about Blender, is that you can keyframe almost any value. I can even do color if I wanted to. So frame 1, I'm going to hover over color and hit I. And you can see there's a little bit of an outline there. It's tough to see, but it is there. And then I'm going to hit the up arrow a couple times. Actually, I'll just hit it to frame 20. Let's change this to blue, like a teal. Hit I, and then I'm going to jump a couple more frames, keyframes, and we'll change that here, and then hit I, and then I'm going to hit play. You can see how that color is changing and is keyframed. The last thing I want to do as far as setup is concerned before we start getting a little bit more into animation proper is I'm going to go to my render engine, and I'm just going to change that to cycles. I keep forgetting to set that as the default, but that's what I want. So yeah, that's another way that you can keyframe. You can also just hover over the viewport and hit I, and it's going to bring up your insert keyframe menu, and you have a bunch of different values you can choose from. You can keyframe all that are available, which I wouldn't recommend. Generally, you only want to keyframe the values that you need. Like, I wouldn't go through and animate all of these properties if I'm not going to change them all. If I'm not going to animate them, there's no reason to add keyframes. It's just going to bog down your dope sheet and your graph editor with unnecessary information. We have location, rotation, and scaling, and then you have some combinations thereof. You have location and rotation combined, so you can add keyframes for both at the same time. You have location, rotation, and scale combined, and you have location and scale and rotation and scale. So any combination thereof, and then some additional transformation options, but really we'll just be focusing on these top 5 or 6. Last couple of notes just before we delete this cube and start bouncing a ball. You can hit spacebar to play. I know I've been doing that. I don't think I called that out yet, so now I'm officially telling you spacebar is to play. And then as you're playing back, you'll notice in the top left, you'll see the frames per second, which is currently bouncing between like 25 and 26 frames per second. I'm going to go to my output properties and just make sure that we're at 24 frames a second. And so once we have that, we're ready to start bouncing a ball and talk a little bit more about animation properly. So I'm going to select the cube, I'm going to hit X to delete it. I'm actually going to select everything and delete it. I don't need it. We also turn that off. Okay, so I'm going to hit 1 to go into front view, and Shift A, add a UV sphere. The defaults are fine as far as subdivisions and all that. I don't need to worry about it. It's going to be a very simple scene, so I don't need to minimize geometry. And the first thing I'm going to do is GZ10. I'm going to move it up 10 units, so it's up in the air. It has some potential energy. I'm going to use this x-axis as the kind of fake ground plane. I don't really need to add a plane. We're only going to be seeing it from this side, so that red line will be enough to indicate where the ground is. So we'll start with the kind of simplest animation that you can do, and that's just 2 keyframes. And I'm only going to move it in one direction. So I'm going to go to frame 1. Okay, I'm going to select with it with the sphere selected. I'm going to hit I, and I'm going to set a location keyframe. Okay, you'll notice the location turns yellow here to tell me that there's a keyframe on that frame for that object. If you don't see this, you just hit N to bring that up. You can also go to your object properties, and it'll be there as well. So whichever way that you want to work, you can. This is probably a cleaner way to do it. So we've set the keyframe on the first frame. Now we're going to go, we'll say 20 frames. We'll go 15 frames. 15 frames down, and then I'm going to move it G, Z, and I want it to be right on the ground, so that's going to be -9. Okay, you see this turns orange, telling me I've changed the value. I'm going to just hover that over that and hit I. And now we have a keyframe. Okay, so now I can hit space to play, and this is what we get. We have animated. We have made something move. But we can make it better, and to do so we need to kind of understand a few different principles about animation. I'm going to take this opportunity to do a brief aside. If you are serious about getting into animation, character or otherwise, I would absolutely encourage you to get this book. The Animator Survival Kit by Richard Williams. There's actually 2 versions. There's this version, which is $25 softcover, and then there's the expanded edition, which has a couple of extra chapters in it. Either way, they're both great. It's kind of the animator's Bible. Richard Williams was the animation director on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He also he learned at Disney from all of the kind of classic golden age of animation Disney animators. So he definitely knows what he's talking about here. The book is full of these breakdowns of animation, and it applies to hand-drawn 2D, also applies to 3D. It all works. He's got some lovely cartoons in there as well. And you can see how he kind of breaks down animations and the timing and the spacing. If you ever search for like walk cycle reference, you'll see this image. This is from that book. Every time I do a walk cycle, I refer to it as well. So check it out. It's very much worth your time and your money. I have a copy sitting on my desk right now. So that out of the way, let's talk about how this sphere is moving. By default, you'll notice that there's a little bit of ease in and ease out. Okay, it slows down before it hits the ground. So to help you visualize kind of what's going on here, turn that back off again. I need to change that shortcut. To help you visualize what's going on here, I'm going to split my view. So I'm going to hover my mouse on the top left here. You see that the cursor turns into a little plus. I'm going to drag to the right. Okay, and then I'm going to change this view to my graph editor. Okay. So let's take a minute and talk about what this graph editor is, what it's showing, and how to read it. If you've worked with After Effects and the graph editor there, this is the same thing, or any other animation program with the graph editor. They all generally work the same. What this does is, I'm going to expand this out a little bit so you can see, it takes the values that you are keyframing and it graphs them here. So on the x-axis in the graph editor, we have frames. So you can see the actual frame range up here. So frame 1, frame 5, frame 10. You can see that's mirrored here on the timeline and the current frame indicator. So as you scrub one place, you scrub all places. So that's frames. And then on the y-axis in the graph editor, on the vertical axis, we have values. So you can see right here, if we look at our z location, which is this blue line, I can turn off the other two and just focus on this z location. At frame 1, the value is 10, which, if you remember, we moved this up 10 units. And you can see here in the transform section, the value is 10. Okay? And then if we move 15 frames forward, that value is 1. Okay? The z value is 1. You can see the origin, because that's what it's graphing, is how that the origin of the object is transformed, is at 1 now. Okay? So that is just those two keyframes by themselves. That is the timing. Right? The timing, it takes 15 frames to move from point A to point B. But there's more information here than just the timing. There's also information about spacing, about how that ball gets from one spot to the next. And that's the spacing. That's why we have a curve, and that's why we have handles on these vertices. Okay, these handles work like any Bezier curve. You can select the keyframe itself. You can scale it, and you'll see those handles will get larger, and that's going to flatten out the curve at the beginning. You can rotate them. You can select them individually and rotate and scale. Okay, and move if you want to. And you can see as I do that, it's affecting where the ball is. Okay? So, by default, what we have here is this ease in and ease out. That's the spacing of this sphere. But we can change that. And I'm going to illustrate this by duplicating this sphere. So I'm going to hit Shift D, and then I'm going to move it along the x-axis 3 units. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. Okay, and I'm going to keyframe those new locations. I'm going to come down here, GX3, hit I, and grab my third one, GX6, and hit I. Whoop. Hit I. Okay, so I have 3 balls. And they just fall. They go from 10 to 1 at the same time. They have the same timing and the same spacing. Now, I'm going to select the second sphere. And in the graph editor, as I select them, the graph editor is only going to show me what is selected. If I want to change that, I can click right up here where it says only selected. I can uncheck that. But I'm not going to do that because it's just going to get confusing at this point. So I'm going to grab the middle one, and in the graph editor, I'm going to right click, and we have interpolation type, or interpolation mode, excuse me. I'm not going to worry about easing, I'm not going to worry about dynamic effects, I'm just going to worry about these three options right here. So Bezier is what it is by default, okay, and that's this kind of natural ease in and ease out. If I go to, T is the shortcut, by the way. If I go to linear, now it's a straight line. I'm going to hit play. Okay, it's kind of tough to see with the extra spheres there, so I'm going to just isolate that one sphere. Okay, so now it's moving at a constant speed. It doesn't ramp into it, it doesn't slow down before it hits the ground, it's just moving at a constant speed. Okay. Now let's look at this third one. Right click, and I'm going to go to constant. So now we have this kind of stair-step effect in the graph editor. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. It's just jumping back and forth between the two. So, with these three examples of the interpolation type, we can start to understand how the shape of the graph affects the movement of the spheres. Okay? So we'll select them all. You can see how they all start at the same time and the same point. They all end at the same time and the same point. But how they get there is different. So with this constant one, if we read this graph, the value is 10. And the value is 10, and the value is 10, right until the next keyframe when the value isn't 10, when we've decided the value is something else, 1. Okay, so constant is going to keep whatever value you have keyed until you tell it otherwise, until there's a new value entered. Okay, so it's just going to jump around. All right, so if there's a flat curve, that means the value is not changing, which means, in this case, the ball isn't moving. When it's vertical, it's jumping. It's changing instantaneously. In that same frame, in that same 1/24th of a second, that ball is moving from 10 to 1. Okay? So horizontal doesn't move, or doesn't change value, because you're not necessarily only going to be keyframing location. But in this case, it is motion. So flat, no change. Vertical, instantaneous change. Okay. Now, if we go to this middle one, we have the linear interpolation. And linear is just a straight line. It's going to move at a constant speed between the 2 points. Okay, it doesn't speed up at the beginning. It doesn't slow down at the end. Just going to move at a constant speed. And I'll tell you what I'll do to maybe make this a little bit clearer. I'll select all three and select that keyframe. I'm just going to hit G to move the keyframe in the timeline. I'm going to move it out to 30, so it'll be double speed. See, the graphs automatically update, and now I can hit play again and get a better sense of how this is working. Okay? So linear, it's a constant speed the whole way, straight line. Alright? And now we have our Bezier curve. And we can focus on that again. Alright, so this is going to speed up and then slow down. So if we look at what that curve is doing to indicate that, at the beginning, the curve is flatter. Okay, so it's not completely flat, which means it is moving a little bit, but it's moving slowly. And then the curve gets steeper, which is when it speeds up. Okay, so we can infer from this that the flatter the curve, the slower the movement, the steeper the curve, the faster the movement. And then at the end, it flattens out again, which means it slows down as it touches the ground. Okay. The last thing is looking at not just where it is at any moment, right? Not just that it's mostly flat here and it's steeper here, but we can also look at the shape of the curve and how it changes over time to indicate acceleration or deceleration. So because this curve is going from flat to a steeper towards a more vertical slope, it's speeding up. Okay, it's moving. It's not changing a whole lot. Like if we look at between frames 1 and 5, this value goes from from 10 to about 9.5. Not much at all. But if we go to a steeper part of the curve, frame 10 it's at 8, frame 15 it's at say 5.75. Right? It's changing a lot more in these 5 frames than it is in these 5 frames. Okay? So it's accelerating because it's getting steeper. And it can accelerate down, it can accelerate up, but it is accelerating. And then towards the end, it flattens out, which means it slows down. Okay, so that's kind of how you can read these curves and get a sense of what they're doing. We can also, if we turn all of these spheres back on, in the object properties, we have this motion paths section, and we can calculate that. Nothing to show yet. Come on. There we go. Calculate. And we can set the end frame to 50. That's fine for this. I'll do the same thing here. Now these don't always update as you make changes to the animation, but what this can do is show you your timing and spacing. So again, here with the constant one, all of the keyframes, or all of the frames, so you've got these orange dots are the keyframes, and the white dots are just the frames in between, just the automatically interpolated frames. So on this constant one, we've got all the frames are here, right up until frame 30, which when it jumps down. With this constant interpolation, you can see that each one of these frames is evenly spaced along the path. And then in the Bezier interpolation, we've got the frames are clumped towards the ends, which means it takes more frames to move this little bit, which means it's going to happen slower. Okay, as 2 keyframes are, select all of them again. I'm also going to get rid of the motion paths. That can be a useful tool, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. If I select all of these, and we look at just the timing of these keyframes, the closer they are together, the faster things happen. So when it's a 30-frame animation, that's how fast everything is. When I take when I take these keyframes, hit G to move them into 10 frames, things are going to happen a lot faster. Okay, so if you want to slow something down, spread out the keyframes. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the basic controls that you have with animation. There's one more thing, and that's the handle type. So if we go to this Bezier curve or Z location and we select a keyframe, now we've got these handles, and we can adjust these handles in a number of different ways. And we will get to that here in just a moment. Okay, so now I'm going to select these second 2 spheres and delete them, and we're just going to focus on this one. Okay, I'll get rid of my origins again. Okay, so we can start with what we already have animated, and we'll make adjustments as we go. I'm going to set my end frame to, we'll do 200 for now. That's going to be too many, but we'll keep it there for now. And frame 1, we're going to start there. I like that. Whoops. When I hit the wrong button, my screencast keys go off. There we go. Okay. And the second frame I'm going to move that up. We'll move it to frame 20. That'll work. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to make this bounce. So we're going to need more keyframes. I'm going to move forward another 20 frames, and this is just going to be blocking in the animation. Okay, I'm not worried about getting it perfect right away. There's plenty of tools to adjust timing and spacing and position and everything else that you need to modify and refine it. For right now, I'm just trying to get the keyframes established so I have something to work with. So I'll go another 20 frames forward, and this will bounce back up. Let's say, we'll say 8 meters. Well, actually, we'll go up to 7. We'll move it 7, so that's at 8 meters. Okay. Then I'll hit I, set a keyframe for it. And I'm not going to worry about the graph editor right now, so I'm just going to push that back a little bit. I'll go forward another 20 frames. This needs to go back to 1, so I'll just type that in, hit I. And at this point, we can even turn on auto keying. So I'll do that. Go forward another 20 frames, and I'll move it up a little bit. Let's say I'll go like 5.5. It doesn't have to be exact. Now you'll notice when I turn on auto keying, it's going to set a keyframe for location, rotation, and scale. Keep that in mind. I usually like to only key what I'm specifically animating, but auto keying is really nice, so we'll keep that on for now. So that bounced back up, and then it's going to hit the ground again, so this is going to be 1 again. And then I'll move it back up. And it was at 5, so let's go to, I don't know, 3.5 maybe? Something like that. Go for another 20 frames. Back to 1. Another 20 frames. Something like that. Set this to 1. Then up. See, we're going to need more frames. Just temporarily anyway. I probably could have done this at 10 frame intervals, but that's alright. Okay, another 20 frames. Back to 1. 20 frames. A little bit. Back to 1, and then the last bounce. And back to 1. Okay. So I'm going to hit play. And this is what we get. Which doesn't really feel like it's bouncing. It feels like it's on a rubber band or on a spring. Right? It's just oscillating. And it's because the default Bezier curves. Okay. I should also note in the graph editor, you can use middle click and drag to pan your view around. Shift middle click and drag also works. Scroll wheel to zoom in and out. You can also control middle click and drag, and you can scale it in specific directions. So you can frame up the graph however you want. You can also hit A to select everything, and number pad period to frame up everything that you have. Okay, so I can see my graph editor, and I've got a bunch of extra information on here, so I'm going to just turn off all the channels that aren't animated and just focus on my Z location. Okay. So now we can start making some adjustments to this animation. First thing is that this doesn't feel like it's bouncing, and that's because it's slowing down as it gets closer to the ground, which is not how gravity works. Things accelerate until they hit the ground. So we need to replicate that a little bit. I'm going to kind of zoom this out a little bit and just focus on the first bounce for now. Okay. That's that. And actually, as a comparison, I'm going to duplicate the sphere. When I duplicate it, sphere 1 here, see all the animation data is also duplicated, and I want to move it over, but because it has keyframes for the X location on every frame, I'm going to have to move and keyframe every frame, and I don't want to do that. So instead what I can do is I can select just the X-axis keyframes, and in the graph editor I can move them up. I can change the value and the position. If I hit G to move them and Y to lock it to the Y-axis, I can just move it over. Okay, I can even GY4, right, and move that whole thing over, moving all the keyframes. So you can adjust the values, not just the curves, we can actually adjust the values and the timing of your keyframes in the graph editor. So with that done, go back to my Z location and select the first sphere and hit space. And you can see now they're doing the exact same thing. They look like they're both on bungees. But now let's make this first one look a lot better. So I'm going to zoom in here to this first bounce. And one of the nice things about doing a bouncing ball exercise is that the graph editor very clearly represents the animation that's happening. This won't always be true. All right, you're not always going to be animating vertical movement where the motion of the object is mirroring the graph editor. But especially early on, it's helpful to have that visual similarity. So now we're going to talk about the handle types, which is a thing that I kind of skipped over earlier. So I'm going to select one of these vertices at the ground, actually this first one specifically. I'm going to right click, and now we have this handle type menu. V is the shortcut. Whoops. V is the shortcut. And we have 5 different options. We have free, aligned, vector, automatic, and auto clamped. All right, and if you hover over each, it'll tell us what they are. So free will completely independent manually set handle. That's what we're going to end up going with, but we'll come back to that. We have aligned, which will manually set the handle with rotation locked together with its pair. We have vector, which will automatically create straight lines. So it's an automatic handle type, and then its goal is to create straight lines, straight curves. Automatic will create smooth curves automatically, and then auto clamped will create smooth curves which only change direction at keyframes. Okay, so if we look at, probably not going to see a whole lot of difference right here with auto clamped. Use the shortcut V. Automatic, you can see what automatic does. Now the problem with automatic, we zoom in here, we can see our keyframe is set to 1, but the curve dips below that. All right, and that's not something that we want. Now the ball is going through the ground. As a general rule, you want your keyframes to be at the extremes. If you want this to go slightly below 1, put a keyframe there. Don't rely just on handles to get the ball, below 1. Actually put a keyframe there. If you don't want that, then don't use these handles. You can go back to auto clamped, and you can see that now it fixes that. We have vector. So vector, you can see, is making a straight line. Okay, but now it's not completely straight because the keyframes on either side of it are not set to vector. And we can select a handle. We can move it around. We have some control over it. We can rotate it a little bit, but that can be our starting point. And V again. We have aligned, and so what aligned does gives us control gives us some control, but it's still doing the terrible thing. Let's see. There we go. So aligned is you can kind of rotate it. There you go. So you can rotate it, but you see the handles stay in line with each other. Okay. I'll undo that and just go back to flat. And then lastly, we have free, which allows you to move each handle independently. And so, okay, so we can move it, which will allow us to change the length of the handle and kind of rotate it around. We can also just scale it if you prefer. If you scale it, it'll keep it on that same line, same direction. And you can rotate, which will allow you to change the direction but keep the same length. Okay, so getting back to this animation, we want the ball to accelerate towards the ground, which means we want, I'm going to spread this out just a little bit, okay, means we want this curve to keep getting steeper and more vertical until it hits the ground. So with the handles set to free, V, free, I'm going to rotate this handle until we get that. Okay, so now we have this shape. I'm going to scale that up a little bit as well. I'm also going to take this handle and I'm going to scale this up a little bit as well. Okay, so now it starts kind of slow, and then as it goes, it picks up speed, and then hits the ground. Okay, so let's look at what that does. Just that one change. Start at frame 1. Okay, that's just 1 to 20, and I'll isolate just that range. Okay, it's tough to see because it jumps right after it, but it is accelerating towards the ground. So, in order to really make that feel real, I need to do the same thing with the other half. So I'm going to rotate that. I'll scale it up a little bit as well. I'm not going to scale it up as far because it's not bouncing back as far. So I don't need to be quite that extreme. Also select this, and I'll maybe scale this out a little bit as well. Give it a little bit more hang time. Okay. Alright, so by scaling this out, I've increased the amount of the curve that's flat, so it's going to hang in that air just a little bit longer. Okay, so I've adjusted the first bounce, and only the first bounce. Now we'll hit space, and we'll just focus on like the first couple of bounces here. Okay, you can see how much better that first bounce feels. Okay, and so what we can do is go down that line and do the same thing the whole way down. I'm going to hit Control Space with my mouse in the graph editor, so allow me to just focus on this view. And then as I Control middle click and drag my mouse vertically, I'm going to expand the height. It's not changing the values, it's just changing kind of the zoom in the graph editor, and makes it easier for me to see what's going on. So I'm going to do that just so that I can select all of these bottom vertices, and then hit V and free handle type. So I make that change all at once. Then I can hit A to select everything, and number pad period to frame that up. And I know I'm going to want to make that change to everything, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. I don't need to see the viewport to make these changes. So I'm just going to hit G so I can move and rotate at the same time. Okay, and what I'm looking for is this bounce to be even on both sides. Okay, conservation of energy, Newtonian physics. So I can see that this handle goes up to about the 4.5 or 4.25 mark. So I'll do the same thing here. Oops, just grab the handle. Do something like that. And this one's not going to be up quite as high, okay, because it's not bouncing as high. And we'll do the same thing all the way down. This one's going to about 3.5. Oops. And make sure you don't actually accidentally move the keyframe. We just want to be adjusting the handles here. I'll also select this, and we'll scale it up a little bit. And here we'll go up to about 2.5. And you'll see another problem developing here that we will address shortly. I just want to get all of these set first. About there. Okay. This one. Get down to the really fine details. So you can, again, expand that graph out a little bit to, if it helps you visualize what's going on. Yeah, like we need to bring this one up quite a bit. There we go. That looks better. You do have to select the keyframe first in order to select the handle. Right, it's not, all those handles aren't visible until you select the keyframe, then you can grab the handle. Oh, there we go. I'm just going to rotate this one up a little bit. And same thing here. Let's rotate that up a little bit. Okay. So now we have all of those set. That's not super even, but we'll fix that in a second. So I'm going to hit Control Space again. Go back to my regular view. I'll set my end back to 300. And we'll take a look. Okay. So at this point, I think it should be pretty obvious that there's a bit of an issue later in the bounce. Right, the first bounce feels pretty good, but now at this point it's like it's floating because it's taking so long. Because it's not bouncing as high, so it shouldn't take the same amount of time to go up and down here when it's only bouncing 0.3 meters versus here when it's bouncing 9 meters. Okay? So now we need to adjust some of that timing. Here we've adjusted the spacing by changing the shape of the curve, okay, by having it ease in to the top, to the height, to the apex of the curve, and having it accelerate down towards the bottom. Right, that's the spacing. Now the timing is when do these bounces actually happen, and they shouldn't be evenly spaced the whole way. So we need to make those adjustments. And we can do that just in the timeline. So I'm going to select everything except for the first bounce. And we'll start making these adjustments. So this second bounce, I'm going to make it just a couple of frames shorter. So I'm going to hit G in the timeline. I'm just going to move it one frame over. Deselect that first one and move that one frame over. Okay, so that was both sides of this bounce, or a frame shorter now. And then the second bounce, right, which is now frames 58 to 98, I'll make it 2 frames shorter on each half. So 1, 2, whoops. Deselect that one. That's the first half here. And now we need to change this one, so G -2, hit return. Okay. And just playing those first couple of bounces back, I think that's feeling a lot better. Now we're still getting floaty towards the end, so we need to just keep going with that. And the next one, G -3. By the way, as I'm doing this, there is not a formula. I mean, there are physics formulas for how things bounce, but with animation, it's not every ball is going to bounce the same way. Okay, how you set these keyframes and these curves is going to be determined by what that ball is supposed to be. What is it supposed to be made out of? Is it a bowling ball? That's really hard. Is it a tennis ball? Is it a water balloon? Is it a really hard surface? Is it inflatable, or is it just like a marble? All these things, is it thrown? Is it dropped? All these things are going to have an impact on how you choose to time and space these animations. So it's helpful to, once again, find a bunch of reference. I know there's a bunch on YouTube. You can also just grab a tennis ball and take your phone and film it. Film it in slow-mo if you can, and really kind of analyze how that's going. That being said, perfectly copying reference video isn't always enough to get something to feel alive and real. The nature of animation kind of requires a little bit of exaggeration to help things feel alive. So keep that in mind, but just, as you keep doing it, and that's what the homework is going to be. This week is going to be doing more of this, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. But yeah, just think about reference, think about what this is, and how this is going to behave as if it were an actual material. Is it going to bounce back up most of the way on the first bounce, or is it only going to bounce a little bit after the first bounce? These are all adjustments and choices that you can make. So we're going to go -4 on that one, -4 on those, -5, -6, oops, 73, so 58 to 73, that's going to be 15, that's 14, okay, lost my place there for a second. I think I'm still off. So that's 15 and 15. That's 14 and 14. That's 13 and 13. Okay. I think I'm off a little bit, but that's alright. Not that big a deal. Okay. So now that I've basically each bounce I'm making shorter and shorter because it's not bouncing up quite as high. And you may need to, at this point, come back in here and make some adjustments to your curves. Maybe the handles don't need to be quite as extreme. Maybe this one can scale back down a little bit. That's all okay. It's definitely an iterative process in that regard. You can also decide that maybe, maybe these are all bouncing back up a little bit too high. So you can G and Y and change that value down a little bit. From there, now our end frame is roughly 240. Okay. Now we hit spacebar and we'll see how that feels. It still probably feels a little bit floaty, especially at the end there. That needs to not be quite so long, but it's not bad. Okay, so I can go on and refine this some more, but I want to move on to the next thing, which is going to be taking a static bouncing ball that's only moving in one direction and make it move in a couple directions, and also add a little bit of squash and stretch and a little bit of rotation. So that'll be the next bit.